Hi, I'm Barry Bradley, head of supply chain here at Crisp. It's an incredibly exciting time to be in the supply chain right now. There's a lot of newness, a lot of change, and a lot of constraints that we need to be able to work through. And the answer to a lot of that is, how are we going to use data? We continue to read articles about how big data, advanced analytics, automation are improving supply chains across the world. So the question is, how can it help improve my organization? And that's something that we'll talk with today, how we can prepare your organization to use data to the best of their ability. Now, before we jump in, a brief background of myself. I've got a high-level end-to-end supply chain background across a number of different parts of the supply chain organization, whether that's procurement, supplier relationships, distribution, and supply chain process across both retail as well as CPG. Now at Crisp, what I'm able to do is work with customers to make sure that they're using data to the best of their ability to help their organizations become data ready and maximize their growth potential. So with that, let's jump in. Today, we're going to talk about a couple of different things about how you can make your organization data ready. And the first thing we're going to cover is the power of data. What is the why behind how we need to be able to use the data and why it's important to our organization to get, collect, and fold into what we're doing as an organization. Next, we'll get into the 4 steps of data readiness. This is how your organization can set a successful data foundation to make sure that they're able to maximize what data is available to them. It starts with setting the strategy, making sure that we have a good strategy for our organization to enable us to best use our supply chain data and set ourselves up for growth. A good strategy also helps our organization prevent churn, prevent asking the same questions, and making sure that we're making decisions fast and everyone in the organization is on the right page. Next, we're getting into define, process, and insights. Understanding across the organization, what are the leading indicators that we could have some trouble coming up, and how we can make sure that we're able to get the insights from the data that we have. Third, we'll get into how we're actually going to go collect that information. How do we actually go get the data that's available to us and make it useful for our organization? Finally, now that we have that information and we know what we're measuring, how do we build action plans to make the most of it? How do we make sure our organization is set up for success with the data that we have? Finally, I'll jump into a little bit about what's next in this space, how data and organizations will evolve so that they can take the next step once they have the data foundation ready. So before we get into how to build that solid data foundation, let's talk about the problem statement, why we're here, and why data is so important to build an agile, resilient supply chain. And the answer is that it provides visibility and transparency. Data is critical in understanding across the organization how we can continue to get better and that what our problems are that we need to address in priority order. A recent survey of procurement leaders talked about using data and analytics in their enterprises help them increase their ROI by 15 to 20%. And this is because understanding where your problems are, using data to get a better view of your supply chain and visibility of the organization, allows you to invest and prioritize in the correct projects to make sure that you're critically enabling your strategy. Also, when we talk to our customers at Crisp, they're able to use our dashboards and our analytics to decrease their out of stocks 2 to 7%. This is critical for suppliers fighting in the supply chain to make sure that they have the product available on the shelf to be able to support that sales growth that the sales teams are fighting so hard for. So we know that data is important and we know it can significantly help our organizations, but it's difficult to get. When we look at that same survey of procurement leaders, up to 50% of their time has spent looking for data. That's a significant draw on resources when people should be writing orders and driving sales and making sure that there's more efficiencies and more resiliencies in the supply chain. Spending 50% of a team's time looking for data is a pretty large task, especially when you consider that a similar survey said that up to 73% of that data goes unused in analytics. So now we've asked our team to spend a lot of time and they're pulling some great information that we're maybe not even using. So understanding how to use the data is just as critical as knowing where it is and being able to actually pull it. Over on the left of the slide, you can see a quote from one of our Crisp customers that one of the key problems that they were having in their business when they move through the retail channel is understanding trends way too late. So looking 6 months in the rearview mirror isn't quick enough to be able to respond to the just-in-time inventory needs that we have in this modern-day supply chain. So what's the answer? Now that we know that data is important and it can significantly help our organization, but it's difficult to get and difficult to understand how to use, how can we make the use of data that's available to us? And the answer to that is process. A solid data readiness process is what separates good organizations from the ones that are struggling to use their data effectively. So the first step of that process is going to be setting the strategy. All good organizations have a very clear strategy that they're able to rally against to make sure that the organization is making the correct decisions, moving the organization forward to the key indicators that they want to be able to move. So as you're setting that strategy, a couple of questions to ask yourself are, what's the white space that can be filled? Why are we here as an organization? And what's that moat that we want to be able to defend that we can stand for? As we set the strategy for our organization, the next thing we're going to do is measure it. How do we make sure that we have some clear, established key performance indicators to understand if we're actually hitting our strategy? This is a crucial step to make sure that the organization knows not only here's where we're going, but here's how we'll know that we've gotten there. And once we set those measures, it's critical that we define our goals so that we define success. Understanding how much effort should we put into what are the clear priorities so we can work through the prioritization of our work, invest our resources in the right things. Defining these goals is critical because it's also going to help us define our trade-offs as an organization. If we take, for example, a retailer's business, one of the things that they're going to look at as a KPI is their out-of-stock situation. Minimizing out-of-stocks is going to be a critical key performance indicator because a key piece of a store strategy is to be in stock so that people can actually buy products that they have. In setting goals, it's going to be important to understand what is that actual out-of-stock goal that we need to be able to hit. Is 1% enough? Is 10% too high? Because with each of those differences, there's going to be a cost that comes with securing that inventory. So understanding those trade-offs within the organization to say, how are we going to define success, helps the organization get on the same page so that when they're making decisions about how much product to buy for a key season or what products to cut in order to make sure that we have the right average inventory, having those clear strategies, measures, and goals across the organization allows them to be on the same page and make decisions that are supportive of our overall success. After we define the strategy, the next big step is to find the process that helps us get there. And this will lead to the insights that help us drive those KPIs that we're looking for. So the first step of that is define our KPIs. So like we said in the last slide, what are the out of stocks that we want to be able to hit? What's the average inventory? What are those key KPIs that are outcomes that are important to our business strategy? Once we've established those, let's map the process to understand how are those outputs actually generated? What are those key steps upstream from that outcome that we can map those different steps in our process mapping to understand what are the leading indicators of those outcomes? And a good benefit of this process mapping is that when we bring the team together to sit down and understand those leading indicators, to understand the steps that lead up to our outcomes, we're clearly able to define who's the owner of these steps. Do we have clear ownership? Do we have an understanding of how the business works and flows through it? Because as we go through it, we can clearly start to see, are there redundant steps that we can eliminate? Are there handoff opportunities where it's not clear? And so we can speed up the process by speeding up some of these handoffs. The process mapping allows us to understand where we've got some opportunities as a business to make our organization more resilient and more efficient. And through that process mapping, as we move further back upstream, we can start to understand what are some common drivers of our outcomes. What are some things that come upstream from those outcomes that will give us an advanced notice that, hey, maybe something's going on here that we need to start to react to? And as we start to discover those process mapping and we go through the measurements, it's clear that we need to understand how we can act and improve this continual cycle over time. How do we get some feedback loop going here in this process to make sure that the process mapping is continually accurate, that our outcomes and our KPIs and our goals are where they need to be? This continual improvement process is what helps us move together and move forward as an organization. So an example of defining and mapping out a process, let's go back to kind of an out of stock example with our retailer. Before we have an out of stock situation, that product is on the shelf. We need to move back and say, before it gets to the shelf, it has to ship to the store. Is there a way that we can measure the product shipping to the store? Did it arrive on time? Did it arrive in full to what we expected? And before it gets to the store, the product actually has to actually arrive at the warehouse. What measurements do we have at the warehouse where we can see, is the product there? Is it moving in the way we want it to move? And finally, even further upstream, before it gets to the warehouse, our supplier has to ship it. And so how can we measure, did that supplier ship the product on time and did they ship it in full? Because if they didn't, now all of a sudden we have our driver metric. We have a leading indicator of out of stock further downstream that we can take a look at and say, if the supplier didn't ship me, now I know a week or so in advance before it even gets to the store shelf that I've got a problem. And with that time, me and the organization can take different steps to avoid an out of stock situation, or at least minimize an out of stock situation at the store shelf, ensuring that we have a good customer experience going forward. After we've mapped those processes, the next step is actually collecting the data. So now that we know what we want to measure, and now we know how it's critical to our strategy, now we have to actually go get the information. A couple of key pieces here when thinking about how collecting the data and how to go out and get the information. There's a number of different things about data that we need to take into account. The first is frequency. How often is this data pulled? How often do we want to go get it? Matching this up with how we're going to use it, with our process mapping, with our measures, is going to be critical. So understanding how will this information be used? Are we going to be reviewing this information weekly? Are we going to be reviewing this information monthly? Is going to help us set up how often we need to pull it. Similarly, how often is the data generated? If we're looking at that supplier fill rate and suppliers only ship us once a week, pulling daily fill rate is probably not going to give us any more information because it only comes in once a week. Secondly is going to be granularity. So understanding that level the data is pulled from. So for example, let's look at time. Do we need to capture data at the hour or at the day? Or are we fine capturing just at the weekly granularity level? Depending on who's pulling this information or who's going to be using this information, they may need different levels of granularity. Your sales team or marketing team may want daily and hourly information to understand, hey, how is this promotion running? Are there any sales trends that I should be getting in front of? Whereas a procurement team, if they're only ordering once a week, maybe a weekly data feed is going to be fine because they're only going to act on it once a week. A third piece in understanding is normalization. And so this is understanding, has anything been done to the data before we started to consume it? After it was taken out of that raw source, has there been any transformation, such as moving it from a calendar date to a fiscal date? What are those different pieces that we need to understand so when we're interpreting the data, we know what to interpret? And finally, consider the source. Where is this data actually coming from? Is it an automatic scan that's pretty high trustworthy? Or is it going to be a manual input that we're going to have to worry or consider that there could be some error, some lack of accuracy here? As you go through these different aspects of data, it's important to understand how an automated company like Crisp can help go through this. Crisp process is to pull data as soon as it's available from the source. So we take care of the frequency and we pull at the lowest granularity. We're also going to be normalizing the data for you, removing any duplicates, allowing for name changes to understand the current convention within your system so the data is more usable. And we're also going to be pulling it straight from the retailer distributor source to be able to get that information directly to you without transforming any of that information. The more you can trust this data and the more we can trust that data source and the more automated you can make that collection with Crisp, the easier it's going to be for your organization to use that data. And going back to that procurement survey, with Crisp, your team certainly won't be spending 50% of their time pulling that information. Now that we've collected the data, a key piece to understand is how do we make sure that data is credible and reliable? And the answer to that is good data hygiene. Within that data hygiene, one of the things that a couple of things we need to understand is first and foremost, do we have clear data and measures ownership? Do we know who within the organization we can go to if there's a problem with the data that we're getting? Do we know who within the organization is in charge of making any sort of changes to those measures or goals or strategies that we established in the first step? After we have that clear data and measures ownership, the second thing is making sure that we have regular audits of that data, making sure that as we go through, we understand, is this source still the correct source? Has anything changed within how this source is presenting this information? Another big benefit of the CRIS platform is that we do all of this for you. With our continual automation of pulling data, we scrub, we make sure that that data is clean and accurate, and any changes to any of the inbound information, we're going to make sure is able to be filtered in and used in the same way that it was before. A third big piece of data hygiene is automating that information, automating that intake like Chris was able to do. As we automate that information, we remove a lot of that manual time that it takes a long time to find information, as well as any of those processing errors from manually inputting from one system to another. Removing that manual aspect is critical in that data hygiene to make sure that we have a trustworthy source of information. And finally, understanding from that data hygiene, how do we remove silos across organizations, making sure that everyone has access to the same information, whether it's your sales, marketing, supply chain team, you're making decisions based off of the same inputs. And so you're able to drive that strategy effectively. The fourth and final step in that data readiness is building action plans. So now that we've set our strategy, we know our good process and the insights that we're looking to drive, and we have that data in our system, what do we do with it? How do we actually make it useful as an organization so we can go through and we can make these quick decisions and be able to respond faster to the inputs we're getting? And the answer to that is through building critical, good action plans. So once we see an issue with one of the outcomes or the KPIs that we're looking at, we're able to understand with this outcome, what are those common root causes that we're able to see? So going through mapping out that, using that 80-20 rule to understand, hey, when we see this, we know it's probably one of these 3 or 4 things that are driving it. And once we establish those 3 or 4 things that are driving it, what are the actions that we should be taking? Once we establish that root cause, we should have a list of critical actions that we're able to take every single time. This is especially important in the supply chain in different areas where we need to act quickly to different shocks. Because instead of taking time after we have that negative outcome and planning what we need to be able to do, if we have a solid action plan, we can jump right in and take that action. So for example, if going back to that out of stock example and mapping it all the way back up to fill rate, as soon as we know that we have a negative fill rate, that we have a fill rate that isn't what we want to be, that's our red outcome. Looking at it, we can see that our driver was the supplier didn't ship enough. When we see that happen, looking downstream, what actions can we take to avoid that out of stock? Whether that's sourcing from a different supplier, whether that's removing promotions or kind of marketing events so that we reduce that extra demand that we're creating. This will help us avoid that out of stock action downstream. Another way that Chris helps organizations with this is through our notification function. So with the dashboards and with the automated data pulling and analysis that we're able to provide, notifications are able to be set around these key metrics to say, hey, your sales are way down, or your out of stocks, your voids are way up. Trigger notifications so that your team then quick put that action plan into place. So now that we've gone through the data readiness plan, the question is, what's next? We've set a solid data foundation. What are we going to actually go do now? What's next in this space is programmatic commerce. How do we make these things more automated, more collaborative? And so as you look at it, a couple of different ways that you can continue to build as an organization after setting that solid foundation. And the first is expanding that collaboration. Whether it's across customers or suppliers or partners, how do you expand those maps of process and that data map to understand higher level, what are those different pieces? What's further up the supply chain? What are the downstream impacts that we're able to collaborate across? And as you set those process maps, establishing joint goals as well is critical, important too, to establish those partnerships and understand what's good for both of us. How can we both benefit from a situation? A next step is continuing that automation. So with Chris, not only automating the pulling in, but how do you automate where that data goes? So using our action plan example, if we know we have a supplier fill rate issue upstream, can we automate a push to the marketing team where it automatically pulls those events? Or can we automatically write orders to a separate supplier so that we can respond to those fill rate issues even faster? A third is, how do we integrate that data across the organization? So now that we have it, now that everyone has visibility to that one source of truth, how do we make sure that people are using it? How do we fold data into the ethos and the DNA of our organization? And this is where CRISP is critical within an organization, because we allow unlimited user licenses. So whether it's suppliers whether it's sales or supply chain or marketing or finance, everyone can get into the platform, be using that same source of truth, that same information. Lastly, is that in order to establish that same source of truth, we need to ensure accuracy. So with that automation, with those data hygiene processes, having that high confidence and that accurate data is going to be critical for all parties involved to be able to use the data most effectively. Finally, with CRISP, you'll always be data ready. CRISP has been designed to help brands understand the information from retailers, distributors, and use it in an actionable, insightful way, whether that's through our automated dashboards or whether it's through us automatically piping in it to any sort of sales, marketing, advertising, business intelligence, or procurement systems. We're here to help you make the most of your data to make it most impactful for your organization. Thank you so much for your time listening to this presentation. If you want to learn more, please head over to gocrisp.com and contact our team for a demo. We're eager to help you use data within your organization to the best of your availability.